Okay, we're going to get started. I think some people will be straggling in as the evening goes on. Heidi Julovitz will be joining us, but she's coming down from Morningside Heights from a class. And so once she's here, we'll have her join the panel. I want to welcome you to this two-day conference. My name is Jim Miller. I'm the director of the new MA program in creative publishing and critical journalism, and I've organized this conference in close collaboration with my dear friend Robert Boyers, so I welcome you to this event. It's meant to celebrate the launching of our new MA and also to celebrate the 50th anniversary of Salmagundi, a little magazine that has proudly trafficked in big ideas. As the conference goes on, we'll dispense with elaborate introductions to each of our distinguished participants. All of you should be in possession of a sheet that has short thumbnail biographies. This also has a schedule of what we're going to be doing tonight and all day tomorrow. Our panels tomorrow are going to be conversational and informal. Interesting people discussing, we hope, in interesting ways, interesting topics. Tonight, however, we're going to begin with a keynote paper by Robert Boyers, which he actually composed about 3 weeks ago and has been polishing ever since, followed by responses to the paper from our 3 panelists who have seen the paper in advance, and that's Jackson Lears and Mark Greif going down the table here, and Heidi Julovitz when she arrives. I will join my colleague and collaborator in designing the new MA, Rachel Rosenfeld, in helping to moderate the responses and subsequent conversation tonight among the panelists, after which we'll open the floor for questions from the audience. Before we begin, I do want to explain why I've organized this particular conference on this particular topic, little magazines and the conversation of culture in America. Almost 50 years ago, I had my first review for a real magazine published in Rolling Stone in its 3rd issue. Rolling Stone would soon become big, but really in 1968, it was actually, to start, really small. They didn't pay anything. And that's a reminder that sometimes magazines start little but become very big indeed. 4 years later, I had my first essay in social theory published in Telos, a little magazine devoted to promulgating phenomenology and Marxism, more or less conjointly, in hopes, improbable though they seem, of forging a small community of philosophical revolutionaries. A few years later, shortly after my first book had been published, I got an assignment to publish what would be the first of many pieces in Salmagundi, a little magazine I already knew because in 1969, in its fat special issue number 1011 on German refugee intellectuals, it had included a translation by someone called Frederick Jameson of an essay by Theodor Adorno at a time when work by Adorno in English was rare as hen's teeth. So Salmagundi was already in the vanguard among those of us interested in critical theory and Marxist approaches to philosophy. In any case, my first assignment from Salmagundi was the beginning of a beautiful friendship with Bob Boyers, with Peg Boyers, with the world of little magazines. I discovered that Salmagundi, in fact, had been created right here at the New School in the cafeteria in 1965. And I soon enough learned that what Boyers was doing with Salmagundi was very closely connected to my own nascent ambitions for myself as a writer and an intellectual. And Robert really became one lodestar for me, joining someone else who's an old friend that's at this conference, Greil Marcus, who I had met through the world of rock criticism, 2 different models converging for me. So when I came to the New School over 20 years ago, the very first person I hired in my new role as chair of liberal studies was Robert Boyers to teach one course a year at the New School for Social Research. And Bob, ever since, has been here and has become a colleague as well as a friend. So to me, it made perfect sense to use the 50th anniversary of Salmagundi as an opportunity to signal a large part of what our new MA stands for, and also to ask several generations of writers and editors and intellectuals to ponder what role little magazines may still have to play in reinvigorating the conversation of culture in America. But enough about this conference. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight's main event, the once and future still undefeated heavyweight champion of my little magazine world, Robert Boyers.
Well, thank you so much, Jim, and thanks to all of you for being here. I will, before beginning, just repeat one thing that Jim mentioned, namely that this little talk was written about 3 weeks ago, which is to say before very recent developments began to hit the front pages of the newspapers, just to bear that in mind. In After Virtue, Alistair McIntyre suggests that when a culture is in good shape, its condition will have much to do with the robust arguments conducted under its auspices about the good or the virtuous. An emphasis there on argument that has always seemed to me compelling. I find it impossible to imagine a social order I would want to live in that isn't built around an ongoing, even interminable series of arguments. No doubt the poet Yeats was right to warn a century or so ago that often in the modern world the best lack all conviction. You know how it goes, while only the worst are full of passionate intensity, so that the arguments such as they are will much of the time seem anything but edifying. And yet we do argue, don't we? And we want to be able to continue doing so as if things mattered and the tools at our disposal were sufficient to allow us to know more or less what we're arguing about. A very good friend of mine told me not long ago that passionate intensity was overrated, and conviction too. And of course I knew what she meant. People with convictions are, much of the time, tedious. Moreover, they are intent upon achieving a grand consensus and, not incidentally, bringing everyone else to their knees. At best, they want us, the rest of us, to feel free to express ourselves, as they like to say, but only on the condition that we find them and their convictions irresistible and keep our mouths shut when we don't. No surprise, really, that passionate intensity seems often to belong most insistently to the commissars of correctness and their inflamed camp followers who have as little use for real argument as they have for genuine difference or diversity. Of course, there are arguments and arguments. Reasonable people even find themselves arguing over whether or not there is any special virtue in being reasonable, contending more than occasionally and with considerable justification that reason is only reason and can satisfy only the rational side of our nature. Others, shall we call them postmodernists, contend that all values are constructions and that disputes about ideas are inevitably hopeless and much of the time incoherent, in the sense that people can only grasp what their own culture or tribe or faction allows them to grasp. Meanwhile, legions of the newly enlightened tell themselves that they must strive to eliminate strain and conflict, so that argument itself will seem more and more to be a sign that things are not as they were meant to be. And mere ideas will remind us all of the sorry fact that we have not yet arrived at the one true idea that will banish all the others. No doubt it is always tempting to say that this is not a good time for ideas. Though people hold them or dismiss them, promote them or disparage them, the ideas are apt often to seem notoriously unstable. Often we think we are debating an idea only to discover that it no longer means what we thought it meant. We proclaim our affection for equality, autonomy, liberation, authenticity, only to find that the meanings of these words and the concepts they name have changed utterly into something unrecognizable. Those of us who have long been wary of big ideas, ideas that mobilize infatuates, find that even modest ideas are routinely appropriated for purposes that can only seem astonishing. This is a time, after all, when students and their mentors at major universities declare themselves endangered by the unsafe and hostile environment created by a professor. Call her Laura Kipnis, if you like, who has had the nerve to publish a so-called offensive article in an online magazine. Thought you understood terms like unsafe, hostile, and endangered, and knew more or less what diversity of outlook or opinion might entail in an academic environment? Think again. The very notion of diversity is now increasingly understood to refer to anything but differences of outlook, which we are urged not to protect, but to suppress and eliminate, so that no delicate sensibility need be challenged or unsettled. A Jewish proverb says, "Don't wish too hard, or you'll get what you want." So you want to make things safe enough to protect yourself and others, not only from shock and awe, but from potentially disturbing thoughts and ambivalences. Don't be surprised if you end up with more than you bargained for. Mae West liked to say that too much of a good thing can be a good thing. And who wouldn't say amen to that? But too much safe and secure and beneficent will never add up to anything good. Of course, ideas have always been at least somewhat unstable. The standard unfavorable sense conveyed by the word prejudice was consistently challenged over centuries by thinkers like Edmund Burke and later T.S. Eliot, who saw in prejudice the goal you hope to arrive at if you are to have a foundation for your thoughts and any hope of conducting a serious argument. MacIntyre changed the way we think about identity by asserting that rebellion against one's own inherited identity is often a powerful way of expressing it. Herbert Marcuse, by no means alone in this, stirred a generation of radicals to consider whether tolerance might itself be an instrument or a symptom of repression, thereby converting the benign idea celebrated by John Stuart Mill and other liberal thinkers into something else. And yet, in spite of this long history of instability in the domain of ideas, it does now seem compelling to consider that it is harder than ever before to argue about ideas without first ascertaining that you and your antagonist share even rudimentary assumptions about what exactly is intended when a concept is invoked. Is judgment an exercise of discrimination, or, as Montaigne had it, an expression of habit? Is the other to be understood as external to oneself or as part of oneself? Is perfectibility to be understood as a delusion or, as Rousseau contended, that which principally distinguishes us from animals? When we say love, are we speaking of the marriage of true minds or of Jacques Lacan's idea that love, this is a quote, is giving something you haven't got to someone who doesn't exist? That's good, isn't it? I had to slip that in. Clearly, anyone can deplore the evolution or disappearance of particular ideas. Each of us knows how to posture on behalf of ideas that seem secure and are now regarded as problematic or naive or irrelevant. Whatever happened, we ask, to the idea of colorblindness we used to think we aspired to in a multiracial universe and now find too quaint even to mention? Can it be that disinterestedness, once we thought a noble ideal has become nothing more than the mask that power wears? Is sympathy the good, plain thing we used to call fellow feeling? Or has it become one of those coercive fanaticisms wielded by people who never saw a moral high ground they didn't like? And whatever happened to banality, now that artworks heavily invested in the elementary or the obvious are hung with pride in major museums and bought up at high prices by influential collectors? Can it be that banality no longer signifies anything at all? That the word itself, like the idea it once expressed, has become perfectly meaningless? Not so easy, is it, to note the progress of such an idea without seeming at least to posture and deplore, to wax nostalgic for a time when you could say banal with some assurance that others would understand what you were going on about. Is there any point, you wonder, in sharing with a young person, your son or daughter, perhaps, your disdain for a collection of brightly lettered sayings framed and hung on a museum wall on the grounds that those sayings are banal and intended to elicit from a viewer no slightest trace of irony or resistance? Can you seriously object, you wonder, to an assemblage of framed banalities which proclaim love is here to stay, or happy are those who make peace, or it would be nice to be able to love your country and still love justice? In sharing my sense of such things with students and colleagues at a recent museum exhibition, I confirmed for myself that banality no longer signifies at all, which saddened me for a moment before I thought that all this bother was really quite ridiculous. My own earnest reflection itself, one of those supersensible soap bubbles bound to blow off and away. Though really, it is a shame, isn't it, that without an idea like banality, we can only respond to love is here to stay with a sort of dumb, anesthetized assent or mild indifference. We need particular words and ideas, like banality, need them and the sharp antagonisms they convey. We want to be able to register disgust when disgust is appropriate, though we want as well to acknowledge how, in the greatest of novels or photographs, the banal is redeemed, made to seem somehow the site or repository of a strange, unaccountable beauty, as in Flaubert's Madame Bovary. To be sure, many ideas that once had much to recommend them deserve, in time, to disappear. The sublime, perhaps, or blaming the victim, or authenticity, when it refers to characteristics that are thought to be fixed and irrevocable, as in authentically Jewish or authentically Black. About such things, people can quite clearly disagree. And of course, I have no program or formula to offer that will settle disputes built around things of this kind, though I can really smile for days on end when I learned that males, authentic males, are fatally engaged with violence, annihilation, and extinction, all as a result of their obsession with achieving and sustaining erection. So much for authentic, for ideas that may well deserve, as I say, to disappear. But the more serious issue has to do with the fact that at present, a great many good and vitally important ideas are apt to be misused and are not, as a rule, honorably employed, even by persons who should know better. Consider, if only for a moment, the ostensibly sophisticated handling of the idea that goes by the name of privilege. In current debates, it is often coupled with the word white, so as to name a condition, a fact, that cannot be disputed, contradicted, or wished away by generous sentiments or liberal platitudes. An idea, white privilege, that is intended, when invoked, to banish any potentially troubling questions. Does the idea describe what is relevant or essential in any encounter between a white person and a non-white person? no matter who those persons are, is an encounter between a Black professor and a white student, an exercise in race relations between a white professor and a Black student. Is white privilege an important factor, even when the white persons in a given encounter are themselves poor and clearly victims of systemic injustices that have thwarted them in spite of their whiteness? My point in raising these questions is not at all to answer them, but to suggest that even legitimate ideas, good ideas, like privilege, are often invoked as conversation stoppers, as blunt instruments wielded so as to inhibit real talk and real thinking, along the lines laid out by Anthony Appiah in an essay published some years ago in the pages of Salmagundi, where he speaks of the racial etiquette, that's his language, that has made it hard to talk about ideas like privilege and systemic racism. My impression, Appiah writes, is that many well-intentioned, non-racist academics who are not Black feel that in criticizing certain ideas, they risk exposing themselves, dare I suggest, to the risk of being accused of contributing to racism. This is not, he goes on to put it mildly, in the best interests of learning, and it is also often condescending, reflecting as it does, this is still Appiah, a refusal to think seriously about racism and to make it possible to distinguish racism from other things, unquote. And thus do we find that ideas, even ideas like racism and privilege, can come to lead lives unimagined by their progenitors. Stalking a lost deed, said Milan Kundera 40 years ago, of those Czech intellectuals who rapidly found to their horror that they had given their allegiance to their communist liberators and to platinum-plated, ostensibly progressive ideas that would soon be used to betray or silence them. Of course, we have long supposed that so-called liberal societies are worth defending precisely because they are committed to pluralism and the clash of ideas. And yet on several fronts, our liberal societies are advancing towards what a number of thinkers call missionary regimes, promoting what they take to be advanced values. These values are informed by ideas whose status is, or is felt to be, all but unimpeachable. One such idea is rooted in the belief that if you show people the error embedded in their ways of thinking, you will turn them around and save them from themselves. Explain to the religious that their faith is based on illusion, and before you know it, their faith will disappear, that sort of thing. Faith itself, thus an idea you can refute and displace with a better idea. Nor are advanced thinkers who operate in this way to be found only on the political or cultural left. In France, to argue for divestment from Israeli enterprises as a protest against Israeli actions in Gaza is now regarded as a form of incitement to violence and is thus a criminal offense. So much for openness and the clash of ideas in a Western Enlightenment capital, where the going consensus has it that if you teach people not to have bad thoughts, you will save them from error, that is, from drawing unwanted conclusions about the things they see, and that you will thereby offer them an ambivalence-free life. To those who spend much of their time in academic settings, the phenomenon I am associating with missionary regimes will be instantly recognizable. More and more in such settings, the learning agenda is controlled by cadres of so-called human relations or human resources professionals and their academic enablers, who, as David Bromwich has described them, regard learning as a form of social adjustment and believe that it is their business to promote adherence to accepted community values. Those are quotes from Bromwich. Ideas thus are esteemed only insofar as they ordain a safe and accredited direction that we can learn, all of us, to follow. Dialogue is encouraged so long as it is rooted in approved suppositions and clearly headed where we must all want it to go. The atmosphere has about it, as Bromwich sharply observes, the qualities of a laboratory that knows how to monitor everything, and a church held together by the hunt for heresies. But then the life of ideas is also increasingly compromised in precincts beyond the academy. Why should this be so? Clearly, it is not sufficient to point to the instability of ideas. In many respects, that is the least of the problems we confront, and may not be very much of a problem at all. In fact, the problems to which I've alluded here have principally to do with something else entirely. What to call it? Let's say that the something else is the consequence of a failure, widely shared in our culture, a failure to relate to ideas as if they might be radically incommensurable. Big mouthful of a word, incommensurable. Meaning what exactly? Simply, to begin with, that many ideas or values cannot be plausibly or usefully compared. Why not? Because the background presupposed by different ideas, the history and logic informing them, may well be too different for them to be comparable. In accepting incommensurability as between one idea and another, we do not declare that we cannot or will not choose between them, only that neither reason nor logic will certify the correctness of the choice we make. I say that the idea of affirmative action seems to me compelling. I say it, though I know it to be a violation of other ideas I honor, such as the idea that in making assessments and commitments, it is essential not to assign primary or even secondary importance to race or gender or ethnicity. The criterion of compensation or restitution that informs the idea of affirmative action is essentially distinct from and not comparable with ideas that inform a principled resistance to affirmative action. There is no coherent political or ethical system that will allow me to assert with confidence the irresistible superiority of affirmative action as an idea. I embrace it, yes, but I embrace it even now with grave misgiving. Just so, the idea informing choice or a woman's right to choose or abortion rights is not commensurable with a religiously inspired opposition to abortion, which regards it as a sin to terminate a pregnancy. Proponents of both views, each rooted in fully elaborated ideas, often pretend that the one is clearly superior to the other, when in truth, there is no coherent way to compare them. Again, we make our choice, but we deceive ourselves if we suppose that reason is sufficient to validate that choice. It isn't reason, after all, that informs Antigone's decision to bury her traitorous brother in Sophocles' play. In deciding to defy the law and her uncle the king, Antigone does not compare the one idea of rightful obligation to the law with the other obligation to her brother. Antigone chooses, as she must, given who she is, but the essentially incommensurable nature of the ideas at issue cannot be denied or resolved. The tragedy lies in the fact that both conceptions of obligation are legitimate and compelling. We are not, most of us, tragic characters. I myself try very hard not to be. And yet we can surely accept that in weighing ideas, we will often be dealing with incompatibilities and incomparables and proceeding without the help of a fully reliable, overarching standard. Liberal societies have, in general, tended to accept what John Gray calls the agonistic character of the freedoms we enjoy. And there is a sense in which mundane formulas like agreeing to disagree or respecting difference presuppose at least a vague appreciation of incommensurability. Not long ago, you could quote John Stuart Mill on the bad and immoral persons who stigmatize those who hold unpopular opinions. And in quoting him, you would know at least that Mill had helped to create the consensus on which modern liberal societies were built. But that foundation is today not at all secure. And what Mill had to say about English society in 1859, when he published On Liberty, seems now extraordinarily pertinent. In the present age, he wrote, which has been described as destitute of faith but terrified at skepticism, the claims of an opinion to be protected from public attack are rested not so much on its truth as on its importance to society, unquote. To Mill's observation, we might add that for a great many writers, intellectuals, and academics, the agonistic character of liberal culture no longer seems at all an attractive proposition. Our educated classes regard the university chiefly as an instrument of our collective purpose and an efficient engine for transmitting anxiety about ideas felt to be dangerous or out of bounds. Bizarre, of course, that a culture officially committed to diversity and openness should be an essentially conformist culture, and that the hostility to the clash of incommensurable ideas and even to elementary difference should be promoted with the sort of clear conscience that can only belong to people who don't know what they're doing. My old friend Irving Howe, who published my first essays in a little magazine called Dissent 51 years ago this month, wrote back then that every current of the zeitgeist, every assumption of contemporary American life favors the safe and comforting patterns of middlebrow feeling, unquote. We don't use expressions like middlebrow anymore. But in drawing these remarks of mine to a gradual close, I'd like to suggest that the words safe and comforting patterns of middlebrow feeling do accurately identify a good deal of what we contend with. Don't care for middlebrow as a handy term of derogation. I don't much care for it myself. Bracket it if you like, but also consider that the lockstep march of the new commissars setting up to take control of our cultural institutions, from the universities to the mainstream media, has much to do with creating what Irving Howe called safe and comforting patterns of feeling. The favored ideas are informed by a determination not to offend, not to disorient, not to stir discomfort. The idea of learning as adjustment is rooted in hostility to friction or dispute. What Appia described as conversational etiquette is designed to ensure that conversation remain safe and refuse to stray in the direction of ideas that could conceivably cause anyone to feel fatally set apart from others in one's cohort. The desire to make nice is, so I believe, a staple feature of what Howe calls middlebrow feeling, though I won't beat that horse tonight. Let me instead take just a few more minutes, just a few, and turn to the subject of the little magazine. Precarious is the word that comes immediately to mind when I think about it. But then the situation of the little magazine has always been precarious. Modest circulation, lousy distribution, inadequate funding. You see what I mean when I say precarious. To which we might add the fact that the best contributors we have are usually apt to be casting a hungry and ambitious eye in the direction of the wealthy mass circulation periodicals. But then precarious seems precisely what a writer or intellectual would want in the way of a properly challenging situation. Am I wrong about that? So many ways to be wrong and so many things to be wrong about. You can trust me on that, if on nothing else. But no question really that if you want precarious, you can count on life in the precincts of the little magazine to deliver. Of course, a certain kind of little magazine can readily settle into complacency by steering clear of conflict or controversy and publishing what will seem to its own narrow constituency safely genteel or predictably outre. Nothing surprising about that. But then when I think of little magazines, I think mainly not about the worst, but about the best of them. Best in what sense? First, in aspiring to bring us what will rarely be found elsewhere, such as works that are unpredictable and demanding and sometimes very beautiful, works that will not and cannot be ratified by the commercial culture we live in, works that will seem too long or too much in love with the language they employ, or too mischievous or too allusive, or God forbid, too earnest. Works that don't look or sound like they've been tested for correctness or decorum by a committee for public safety. Works, moreover, that don't place too high a premium on being above all things reasonable or moderate or right. No easy certainties and no easy acceptance of uncertainty, as my friend Irving used to say. That's what is wanted and hard to achieve. I'll say it again. No easy certainties and no easy acceptance of uncertainties. And really, you're more likely to find that tension sustained in the pages of a first-rate little magazine than anywhere else. And is that, too, in jeopardy? No doubt it is. If increasing numbers of writers and intellectuals are compulsively attracted mainly to officially sanctioned ideas and to artwork certified by the bureaucrats in charge of our cultural institutions, then even the editors of little magazines may soon be moved to demonstrate that their own ideological papers are in order and accordingly consign their magazines to safely middlebrow and inoffensive. Easy to imagine the signs already plentiful, as in what? In an aversion to speculative thought, in a reluctance to remember that there is an important difference between the enduring and the ephemeral, in a refusal to do the dirty work of draining the vast swamp of slogans and cliches that pollutes the culture, and the sense communicated that ideas and artworks matter only if they don't take you down to what one writer called the treacherous floor of the deepest sea. A grim picture, come to think of it, and is apt to capture the encroaching heart of the matter in the offices of radical or avant-garde magazines, as in the more sober offices of long-established university quarterlies like my own. A subject too large to encompass here, and so a good place to stop so long as I can leave you with a few good words from one Philip Roth, who wrote, "Never for him the tyranny of the we that is dying to suck you in, the coercive, inclusive, historical, inescapable, moral we, with its insidious e pluribus unum." Thank you.